Staten Island District Attorney Dan Donovan, he has certainly got his work cut out for him with the Garner case. And the former assistant Staten Island DA, Jason Leventhal, he is all too familiar with similar cases. Leventhal once represented a black teen who was assaulted by two white police officers who left him in a marsh half naked. Leventhal, well, he spoke to our Dominic Carter about this and also what lies ahead here in the Garner case.
Richard, the key is next month. That is when the district attorney in Staten Island, Dan Donovan, the man in the hot seat, has announced he will take the Garner case to a grand jury. We talked to former Staten Island prosecutor Jason Leventhal, who, as Richard mentioned, who has won several police brutality cases and even settled a case against the officer at the center of the Garner case. We start with Leventhal discussing the grand jury process. You're the excellent person for us to talk to tonight on the eve of tomorrow's big protest. How is this going to play out? What's going to happen?
The grand jury process involves 23 grand jurors at a maximum, 16 at a minimum, who are going to hear evidence presented by the prosecutor and the prosecutor alone. They will hear evidence and determine whether or not they believe a felony has been committed. In this case, we believe it'll be criminally negligent homicide and manslaughter in the second degree. And they will vote. And if 12 out of the 16 or 12 out of the 23 vote that a felony has been committed, then Officer Pantaleo or any other officers who are charged with wrongdoing will face felony charges.
Well, one has to assume going in, counselor, that the benefit of the doubt always goes to the police officer, especially in a community like Staten Island. Is there a possibility at the end of the day the grand jury might ultimately decide not to indict here?
Of course there is. There is a possibility that the grand jury, especially in Staten Island, where it is a community that is sympathetic to police officers, may choose not to indict. However, what's important is that this grand jury, we hope, will realize that what that message, a decision not to indict, will send to the community, which is the message that when you violate the rules, you will not be held accountable.
So you do believe politics, outside influence, may play a role with this grand jury?
Well, certainly the grand jury is going to hear all the evidence, and the influence of their personal biases and sympathy to police officers and the difficult job that we all know they do could play into account, yes.
Dan Donovan, the district attorney for Staten Island, I've known him for some time. You did not, when you worked in the office, it was not under Mr. Donovan. But what do you know of this Staten Island district attorney and about the type of office that he runs?
Well, he runs a very tight ship, and he's very pro-police. He has indicted police officers before. I handled a case a number of years ago where he indicted 2 police officers.
So let's be clear on that. He has, Mr. Donovan's past, he has indicted police officers before.
Yes, he has. And in this case, it's challenging. Anytime I believe a local prosecutor is charged with prosecuting local police officers, it's very challenging, especially for Dan Donovan's office, because it's such a small office. This is an office of 50 or 60 assistant district attorneys who work hand in hand with local New York City police officers every day. So one can imagine the challenges that it is to now have to prosecute officers that they use every day as witnesses.
In your opinion, what's the key here to a prosecution? Is it the fact that it is against police department policy to apply a chokehold, if you will?
Absolutely. The rule against chokeholds has placed police officers on notice that you cannot use a chokehold. It is something that should not come into play, should never come into your mind when force is necessary. Here, the fact that this rule is in place and that this officer violated the rule is a clear indication that he created a substantial and unjustifiable risk to Mr. Garner's life.
In Missouri, as you know, counselor, it's mostly based on what we have in that situation, eyewitness account. But here in New York, you have the videotape that's gone around the world as it relates to the Eric Garner encounter with the NYPD. What role does the videotape play here? Is it a major one?
Absolutely. It's a major role. The videotape will be played for the grand jury. And the videotape really takes out a lot of the questions of what happened. In Missouri, there's going to be conflicting accounts that have already come out, and ultimately a grand jury or jury will have to decide which accounts they believe. Here, the videotape tells the whole story.
Is there any possibility, in your professional opinion, someone that's been on the prosecution side for the Staten Island District Attorney, someone who's been on the defense side, handling cases against alleged police brutality, is there any possibility or any scenario where you see the officers involved with the Staten Island Eric Garner case may testify before the grand jury?
Yes.
Really?
The officer may testify in hopes that he would convince the grand jury that what he did was accidental, and trying to explain why he took Mr. Garner down in the manner in which he did.
And again, you believe there is a possibility a grand jury may say no indictment?
Absolutely, especially a grand jury in Staten Island. Grand juries are known to give police officers the benefit of the doubt when available. And here in Staten Island, a community that is very sympathetic to the police, they may choose to vote a no true bill and not indict Mr. Garner.
It is remarkable that we're talking to you tonight on the eve of this big march that's expected tomorrow, and here's why. The officer involved that apparently applied the chokehold, or some say it's not a chokehold, but Officer Pantaleo, you have involvement with Officer Pantaleo as a lawyer. One of your clients just sued. You were at Reverend Sharpton's rally. Reverend Sharpton called you up on stage and you spoke. One of your clients just sued as it relates to Officer Pantaleo, and the city settled the case. Tell us about that, please.
Yes, it was two of my clients who accused Officer Pantaleo of being personally involved in a public strip search in broad daylight in Staten Island. Touching both
Strip search?
Yes, removing their pants and underwear, touching both gentlemen's genitals in public in broad daylight. To top it off, Officer Pantaleo then arrested these two men for no reason, lying to justify their arrest by telling the prosecutor that drugs that were found on someone's person, in someone's pocket, falsely told the prosecutors that they were found in plain view on the back seat of a vehicle, thereby falsely justifying the arrest of both of my clients. And the importance of this, Dominic, is once again, Officer Pantaleo has broken the rules. And Officer Pantaleo is an officer who has sworn to uphold the rules. And he's broken the rules in the past. He's broken the rules with Officer Garner. It shows a complete disregard for his obligations to follow the rules.
So, Counselor, as someone who has represented the people as it relates to Staten Island and been on the other side, what do you say to those tonight watching you right now that say, hey, listen, you know what? Cops have a difficult job, and in many cases, they're not stopping choir boys here. They're stopping people that have had criminal involvement with the law, and that we have to support them. What do you say to those folks?
Well, I couldn't agree more. Cops do have a difficult job, and we do need to support them. But we also need to hold them accountable, and we also need to realize that police officers are sworn to uphold the law, and when they don't uphold the law, that has consequences. It has consequences for everyone in our community. It has consequences for our children who deal with them and see that they are not following the laws that they're sworn to uphold.
What is the legality as it relates to police officers in general using deadly force against an unarmed suspect or person?
Well, that leads me to what comes out in terms of Mr. Garner would be alive if he didn't resist arrest. And really that's losing focus of what we require of our police officers, which ultimately is courtesy, professionalism, and respect, and never needlessly endangering our community. And in this case, that's what happened.
So you don't believe there'll be a top charge, Mr. Donovan, if he gets an indictment? It won't be murder? You believe it'll be manslaughter?
Murder, I believe murder would be a very difficult charge to sustain. It requires a finding that Officer Pantaleo intended to kill Mr. Garner. Rather, manslaughter, criminally negligent homicide is an analysis of whether Officer Pantaleo created a substantial and unjustifiable risk to Mr. Garner's life.
I'm completely out of time for this segment, but if you had to predict whether or not there will be an indictment, with the Garner case, what's your guess?
I believe there will be an indictment with the chokehold rule on the books, with the video clearly showing a chokehold, and with the medical examiner finding that the chokehold contributed to Mr. Garner's death. I believe there should be and will be an indictment.
And of course, that's Mr. Leventhal's opinion. We will see what the grand jury, Richard, actually does.
And you know, what's unspoken for folks who aren't familiar with the grand jury process, only the prosecutor presents his case in this, and there's discretion. What case does the prosecutor choose to put on? And that's what people will be looking at. If you put a half-hearted case on right now, you get to have it both ways and say, hey, I gave it to the grand jury, they didn't want to do it. If you do a full-throated a case that you lay out for them as compelling as you possibly can, you got a better chance. There's that famous expression, it's not hard, you can indict a ham sandwich if you want. You know, how the conversation goes. In this particular case, a lot is on the line here for Mr. Donovan, as well as so many other different groups. Good interview, thank you. Now, when we come back, we've gotten different perspectives tonight. We've heard from both the public advocate in this particular case. You just heard from both the former prosecutor as well as now a defense attorney very familiar with Staten Island. Well, when we come back, we'll get the police perspective here. We're going to be hearing from a former homicide detective after the break who talks about both sides of this. And we'll also hear from the PBA president, Pat Lynch, who's the most vocal supporter of the police and the police officer in question on Staten Island. He'll join our own Dominic Carter, telling him why he thinks that Eric Garner was not put in a chokehold, video notwithstanding. That and much more after this.